She was 24 and newly fatherless, and when the solicitor finished reading the will, she had almost nothing to her name. No house, no annuity, no share of the accounts that had been so carefully divided among her stepmother and half-brothers. Only a worn iron key on a length of black ribbon, with no label, no address, and no explanation. Her name was Helen Brooks, and the key would take her, in time, to a place called Juniper Hollow, and to something her father had hidden from every soul who bore his name. Settle in with a cup of something warm. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and if you love a quiet story told properly, stay close to the fire. Helen Brooks had been born in the second-floor bedroom of a narrow brick house on Coppergate Lane, in the market town of Ashwell, in the spring of 1846, to a father who was a land agent for the Marchmont estate, and a mother who did not survive the week that followed. She had no memory of her mother beyond a daguerreotype in a pinchbeck frame, a slight woman in a dark bodice with her hands folded, and a small, uncertain mouth, and she had been raised, in the practical sense, by her father's cousin, Margaret Hurst, a widow of 38, who kept the household and taught Helen to read from the parish Bible and to work a needle before she was 6. Her father, Edmund Brooks, was a quiet man of long silences and careful accounts, tall and lean, with gray at his temples by 40, and a habit of walking to the churchyard on Sunday evenings alone. And though he was gentle with Helen, he never spoke of her mother, and never explained the 2 weeks each summer when he took the coach south and returned dusty, tired, and thinner than he had left. When Helen was 9, her father married again, a Mrs. Cordelia Ashe, the widow of a wine merchant from Norwich, who came into the house with 2 sons of her own, Reginald and Bertram, aged 11 and 13, and a great many opinions about how a girl of 9 ought to conduct herself. Margaret Hurst was dismissed within the month, given a small pension and a letter of character, and sent to live with her sister in Lincolnshire, and Helen was moved to a smaller room at the top of the stairs, and told that she was not to interfere with her stepbrothers' schooling, their meals, or their friends. What she was permitted was the kitchen, the still room, the linen press, and the back garden, and it was in these rooms and beds and cupboards that she quietly grew. She had, before the dismissal, sat almost every afternoon at Margaret Hurst's elbow, and Margaret, who had kept the accounts for her own late husband's chandlery and had known hunger in her early widowhood, had taught Helen the things a woman ought to know when the men in her life could not be counted upon. Helen learned to bake a loaf and mend a hem and set a broken chair leg with glue and clamp, and to keep a ledger in a small, neat hand, and to distinguish good linen from cheap, and beeswax from tallow, and chamomile from feverfew. And she learned, above all, to notice what other people overlooked. Margaret had said to her once, standing at the kitchen window with flour on her wrists, that a clever woman is one who sees the coin lying in the road when every other soul has walked past it, and Helen had never forgotten the phrase. From Margaret, she also had the one object that mattered to her more than any other thing she owned, a small oval locket of plain silver, with a pinch of her mother's hair coiled beneath the glass, which Margaret had given her on the morning of her removal to Lincolnshire, pressing it into her palm at the coach step, and closing Helen's fingers over it without a word. Helen wore it beneath her collar every day of the 15 years that followed, and she touched it, without knowing she did so, whenever her stepmother spoke sharply, or whenever her father came home from one of his long southward journeys and shut himself in his study without lifting his eyes. In the years between Margaret's departure and her father's death, Helen made herself useful in ways her stepmother could not easily criticize. She kept the household books when Cordelia's arithmetic failed her. She nursed Bertram through a bout of scarlatina in the winter of her 16th year. She took over the herb garden and the preserving cupboard. and she copied out her father's estate correspondence in the evenings when his hand grew tired, sitting at the little walnut secretary in the corner of his study while he dictated in his low, even voice. It was in those evenings, more than anywhere else in the house, that she came to know him. The careful way he chose a word, the pauses when a name came up that seemed to trouble him, the two locked drawers at the bottom of the secretary that he never opened in her presence and never explained. She did not ask about the drawers. She had learned, by then, that her father's silences were not empty but full, and that they were not, in the end, unkind. He died in the last week of October 1870, of a chill that turned to pneumonia in 3 days, and he was buried in the churchyard at Ashwell, beside a headstone that already bore her mother's name. Helen was 24 years old, unmarried, without settled income, and, as the solicitor Mr. Penhaligon would explain the following Tuesday, in a small dark office above the ironmonger's on the High Street, without any meaningful share in the estate her father had left behind. Mr. Penhaligon was a small, careful man, with ink on the side of his hand, and a habit of pressing his spectacles up his nose with one knuckle before he spoke. He had known Edmund Brooks for 11 years, and he did not look at Helen when he read. Cordelia sat on the good chair, with her gloves in her lap, and her mouth held very still. Reginald, now 26, and a clerk in a corn merchant's office, sat beside her. Bertram, who had gone into the church and taken a curacy in Suffolk, was represented by a folded letter. The house on Coppergate Lane, with its furniture and linen and plate, passed to Cordelia for her lifetime, and thereafter to her sons in equal shares. The small deposit at the Ashwell Bank, some £380, passed likewise. The interest in the Marchmont Land Agency, such as it was, passed to Reginald, who had already made himself agreeable to Sir Thomas over the summer. There were 1 or 2 small bequests to servants, a sum of £5 to the parish poor, and a note of thanks to Mr. Penhaligon himself. Helen sat with her hands folded and listened. She did not need to hear her own name to know it was not coming. When it came, near the end, it was brief. To my daughter Helen Brooks, Mr. Penhaligon read, I leave the key that Mr. Penhaligon will place into her hand, together with my hope that she will understand in time what I could not, in my life, explain. He looked up then, and he did look at her, and he drew from a small pasteboard envelope a worn iron key on a length of black ribbon and laid it on the desk between them. The key was perhaps 4 inches long, dark with age, its bow shaped in a simple trefoil, and its bit cut in a pattern she did not recognize. There was no tag, no direction, no name. Cordelia's gloves tightened once in her lap. Reginald made a small sound in his throat that might have been a laugh if he had allowed it. Helen picked up the key. She said, Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon. And she put the ribbon over her head and let the key fall inside her bodice beside the locket, and she stood. Mr. Penhaligon rose with her and murmured that he was very sorry for her loss. Cordelia did not rise. On the walk back to Coppergate Lane, Cordelia spoke only once, at the corner by the pump, and she said, without turning her head, that Helen would of course wish to seek a situation, and that a fortnight would be reasonable, and that any of Helen's own things, meaning her clothes and her books and the walnut writing box that had been her father's gift on her 18th birthday, might be sent on if she gave an address. Helen said that she understood. She packed that night. She packed a small leather trunk with 2 dresses, a shawl, a nightgown, 3 sets of underlinen, her mother's daguerreotype in its pinchbeck frame, the writing box, a Bible with Margaret's initials inside the cover, and a linen bag containing needles, thread, scissors, a thimble, a small knife, and a folded square of oilcloth. In her purse she counted £4, 11 shillings and 6 pence, which was every coin she owned in the world. She was 3 days finding the place. Mr. Penhaligon pressed gently in his office the following morning, admitted that a small annual sum, £2.12, had been paid out of her father's private account for many years to a rate collector in a village called Juniper Hollow, in the parish of St. Anne's under Hill, some 60 miles to the south and west, and that beyond that he could tell her nothing, and that he was, again, very sorry. Helen thanked him and left. She took the noon coach from Ashwell to Peterborough on the Thursday, sitting outside, because the inside fare was 2 shillings more, and she watched the flat fen country slide past, with its dikes bright as ribbons, and its willows already stripped to bone. At Peterborough, she slept on a bench in the coaching inn's back parlour, for the price of a cup of soup, and in the morning she took a second coach, south and west, toward the market town of Chipping Barrow, and from Chipping Barrow, a carrier's cart, the following afternoon, along a road that narrowed and rose and narrowed again. The weather turned as they climbed. A thin, cold rain began at 3, and did not stop. The carrier, a broad man named Mr. Hollis, with a wet sack over his shoulders, spoke very little, and did not ask her business. He put her down at a crossroads where a leaning finger-post read, in faded white paint on black, Juniper Hollow, 1 mile, and he touched his hat and drove on into the mist without looking back. Helen stood a moment in the road with her trunk at her feet. The rain came at a slant. The lane before her ran down between hedges of blackthorn and hawthorn hung with the last red haws of the year, and beyond the hedges she could see the shoulders of low hills gone soft and grey in the wet. She lifted the trunk by its rope handle, and she began to walk. The trunk was not heavy at first, and then it was. She changed hands every 100 yards. Water ran down her collar and pooled at her wrists inside her cuffs. The lane bent and dropped and bent again, and at the second bend she came around into a shallow bowl of ground where a stream ran under a stone bridge, no wider than a cart, and beyond the bridge the village showed itself in pieces through the drifting rain, a squat church of blackened limestone with a short square tower, perhaps 15 or 16 cottages of the same dark stone, with slate roofs stained green at the edges, a smithy with its door open and a red glow inside, and a public house with a sign she could not read from where she stood. Smoke went up in thin blue lines from 6 or 7 chimneys and lay against the hillside. A dog barked once and stopped. Somewhere behind the church a sheep bell answered. Helen set the trunk down on the bridge and rested her hands on the parapet and looked. She did not know which of the cottages, if any, was hers. She did not know whether the key at her throat opened a door here at all. She knew only that she had walked out of one life on a Tuesday morning and into whatever this was on a Saturday afternoon, and that the rain was cold, and that her father had paid £2.12 a year for a great many years to keep something in this place waiting for her. She lifted the trunk again and crossed the bridge, and the first person she saw was a woman in a black shawl at the door of the public house, drawing in a cat. Helen asked her, politely, if she knew where the rate collector might be found on a Saturday, and the woman looked at her once, from bonnet to boots, and pointed with her chin toward a low cottage at the far end of the row. The rate collector was a Mr. Peckett, a lean man of about 60, with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead and a napkin still tucked into his collar from his tea. Helen said her name and her father's name and gave him the address on Coppergate Lane. Mr. Peckett went very still for a moment, as though a thing long expected had at last arrived, and then he wiped his mouth and asked her to sit while he fetched a book. He came back with a black-bound ledger and a small tin box. He turned pages until he found the entry, and he read it out to her plainly. The property was a stone cottage and a paddock of just under an acre at the eastern edge of the village, known in the parish books as Wren's Piece, purchased in the spring of 1847 by Edmund Brooks of Ashwell, for the sum of £112. The rates had been paid annually, without fail, for 23 years. From the tin box Mr. Peckett drew a folded paper, the deed, in her father's careful hand, and a second, smaller key, brass, for the outer gate. He asked whether she had a key for the door. Helen drew the ribbon from her collar and showed him the worn iron key with the trefoil bow, and Mr. Peckett nodded once and said, "That will be the one." He walked her there himself, in the rain, without a coat, holding an umbrella of black gingham over her head and letting his own shoulders take the wet. The cottage stood behind a low wall of the same dark limestone as the church, with a wooden gate hung on iron hinges, gone orange with rust. The paddock beyond was gone to nettle and dock, and the seed heads of last summer's thistles. The cottage itself was small, 2 rooms below and 2 above, Mr. Peckett said, with walls perhaps 18 inches thick, a slate roof missing 4 or 5 slates on the north pitch, a stone chimney at either gable, and a stout oak door under a shallow porch of cracked flags. The window frames were of oak gone silver gray, the glass leaded in small diamond panes, 3 of which were cracked, and 1 gone entirely and stuffed with rag. A climbing rose, long unpruned, had woven itself through the porch post and up under the eave, its hips red and heavy with rain. Mr. Peckett gave her the gate key and the deed and the tin box, and touched his hat and left her to it. Helen stood at the gate a moment, then went in and set her trunk under the porch and fitted the iron key to the lock. It turned stiffly, with a small dry cough of grit, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned but held. Inside, the air smelled of cold plaster and old wood ash and mice. The floor was of wide elm boards, dark with age and gritted with the dust of years. A stone-flagged kitchen ran the width of the ground floor, with a black iron range under a wide arch chimney, a scrubbed deal table pushed against the wall, 2 rush-seated chairs, a dresser with a few plates still standing on their edges, and a shallow stone sink under the window. Beyond the kitchen was a small parlor with a plain fireplace, a settle of dark oak, and a rag rug faded past color. The narrow stair rose from the parlor to 2 rooms above, 1 at either gable, each with a small iron bedstead stripped of everything but its ticking mattress, and each with a low window looking out over the paddock and the hills. There was a smell of damp in the north bedroom where the roof had let water in, and a brown stain ran down the plaster like a slow tear. But the beams above were sound, and the floorboards did not give. Everything was very clean under its dust, as though the cottage had been swept and shut up years ago by someone who intended to come back and had not. Helen went from room to room and touched the walls and the mantels and the sills, and when she had seen everything, she came down again and stood in the middle of the kitchen and put her wet hands flat on the deal table. Her father had bought this in the spring of 1847, 6 months after her mother had died. He had kept it 23 years and told no one. She sat down on one of the rush chairs, still in her wet cloak, and she did not cry. She looked at the range and thought about a fire. Then she rose and went to find dry wood. There was a lean-to at the back, with a stack of split ash under a canvas that had rotted at the corners but held in the middle, and beneath it the wood was dry enough. She laid a fire in the range with kindling from an old apple crate and lit it with a lucifer from her linen bag, and while the fire took, she went upstairs and changed into her second dress and hung the wet one from a nail. She unpacked her trunk onto the deal table, the writing box, the daguerreotype, the Bible, the linen bag, £4 and 11 shillings and 6pence in a small purse, and she made an inventory of what she had and what the cottage lacked, and she wrote it in pencil on the back of an old envelope. It was while she was crossing to the dresser to see whether any of the plates were sound, that she noticed the flagstone. The kitchen was floored in local limestone flags, roughly 2 feet by 18 inches, worn smooth by generations of feet, and all of them were bedded tight and level, except one, near the hearth, which rocked very slightly under her foot. She stepped on it again. It moved a hair's breadth. She knelt and looked at the joint, and the mortar around this flag was not the same gray as the others, but a paler, sandier line, and there were 2 small notches worn into the near edge, as though for the tips of 2 fingers. Helen fetched the little knife from her linen bag and scraped the pale mortar out of the joint. It came away easily, in dry crumbs, as mortar does when it has been mixed thin on purpose. When she had scraped the whole square, she fitted her fingers into the notches and lifted, and the flag came up in her hands, heavier than she expected, and she set it aside on the floor. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, lined with slate, about 1 foot square, and perhaps 8 inches deep, and in the cavity was a tin box, black with a faded green line, painted round its lid, and on the lid, in her father's careful hand in white ink, was written simply, "For Helen." She lifted the box out. It was heavier than a box its size should be. She set it on the deal table, and stood a moment with her hand flat on the lid, and then she opened it. Inside, wrapped in a square of oiled silk, were 2 small canvas bags, tied at the neck with red twine, and beneath them a folded packet of papers, and beneath the papers a smaller parcel, wrapped in tissue and tied with a thread. She untied the first canvas bag, and tipped a little of it out into her palm, and gold sovereigns slid across her skin, bright as new, milled edges catching the firelight. She counted the coins in the first bag, and there were 50. The second bag was the same weight, and she did not count it yet. She set the bags down, and unfolded the papers. The papers were 3. The folded deed to Wren's piece with its parish stamp, a small bundle of receipts for slates and lime, and a mason's labor, dated across the years, in her father's neat column, and beneath them, a single sheet, closely written on both sides, in the same careful hand that had labeled the lid. It began, "To my daughter Helen. If you have found this, you will already know that I could not tell you in life what I am telling you now, and I ask you to sit down and read it through before you judge me." He wrote that her mother had not been Miss Weller of Norwich, as the parish register at Ashwell recorded, but Anne Tyack, born in this cottage in Juniper Hollow, daughter of a shepherd on the Barrow Down flocks, and that his own father had refused the match and would not have Anne's name in the family Bible. He had married her at St. Anne's under Hill in the winter of 1845, with only the parish clerk and a neighbor for witnesses. When Anne died in the spring after Helen's birth, he had taken Helen home to Ashwell and let his father believe what his father wished to believe, and he had bought the cottage the following year from Anne's uncle for £112, so that the place she had come out of would not be broken up or sold to strangers. Twice a year he had come down to see the roof kept, and the rates paid, and the graves in the churchyard tended, and he had put by, 1 sovereign at a time, whatever he could set aside from his own earnings, so that his daughter would not stand in the world with nothing of her mother's in her hand. He wrote her mother's name 3 times over in the last paragraph, as though he had never before been permitted to write it. He signed it, "Edmund Brooks, your father," and beneath the signature he had written, "I am sorry it took so long." Helen read the letter through twice, and then she folded it and put it inside the writing box on the table, and she sat with her hands flat on either side of the box for a long time, while the fire burned down in the range. In the morning, she began. She counted the second bag, and it held 50 sovereigns as the first had, and she wrote the sum in pencil on the back of the same envelope she had used the night before, £100 in gold, and £4.11 and sixpence in silver and copper, and beneath it she wrote a list of what the cottage needed. Slates for the north pitch, lime and hair for the plaster of the north bedroom, 4 panes of leaded glass, and lead came, a load of coal, a quarter of tea, a stone of flour, salt, candles, lamp oil, a besom, soap. She walked back into the village at 9, with the deed folded into her bodice, and the locket, and the iron key against her skin. And she went first to Mr. Peckett, and asked him who in Juniper Hollow could set slates, and who could glaze a leaded window. And Mr. Peckett named Mr. Ashby the mason, aged 52, who lived in the 3rd cottage from the smithy, and old Mr. Doggett, aged 70, who had glazed the church windows in 1859, and still kept his lead knife in a drawer. Mr. Ashby came up that afternoon in the last of the rain, walked round the cottage twice, climbed to the roof on a borrowed ladder, and told Helen he could set the north pitch in a day and a half for 11 shillings, and the price of the slates, and she agreed. He came back on the Tuesday with his son Thomas, 17, and by Wednesday noon, the north pitch was tight. Mr. Doggett arrived on the Thursday, with his lead knife and a small pot of solder, and cut and set 4 diamond panes into the leaded frame, and refused payment, beyond a mug of tea and a slice of the bread Helen had baked in the range on the Wednesday evening. Mrs. Rowe from the cottage across the lane, aged 46, a shepherd's widow with 3 grown sons, came on the Friday morning, with a jar of honey, a small crock of butter, and a hen already plucked, and she showed Helen where the well cover lifted, and where the drain from the sink ran out under the wall into the paddock. She did not stay long, and she did not ask questions. On the Saturday, Mr. Hollis the carrier, who had set her down at the finger post a week earlier, brought up a load of coal from Chipping Barrow for 6 shillings, and would not take the extra 6pence she offered him for the climb. By the end of the 2nd week, the north bedroom had been stripped of its stained plaster, and replastered by Mr. Ashby with lime and horsehair, and Helen had scrubbed the elm boards on the ground floor with soft soap and hot water, and rubbed them down with beeswax from Mrs. Rowe's hive, and the leaded window in the kitchen let in a clean grey light across the deal table. She went once to the churchyard at St. Anne's Underhill with the sexton, a slow man of 60 named Mr. Bligh, and he showed her the Tyack stones along the north wall under the yews. Her grandfather, John Tyack, shepherd, 1794 to 1851, and her grandmother, Mary Tyack, 1798 to 1849, and a smaller stone that read only Anne, wife of Edmund Brooks, 1822 to 1846, and Helen stood by that stone for a while, and set on it a sprig of the red hips from the rose over the porch. The vicar was the Reverend Whitcomb, aged 63, a mild man with knotted hands, who had known Anne Tyack as a girl, and remembered the winter wedding, and when Helen came to the vicarage, he brought out the register and turned it round on the desk so that she could see her mother's name in the clerk's round hand and her father's signature beside it. He said her mother had sung in the choir. Helen wrote the date down in pencil on the back of her envelope. By the end of the 3rd week, she was known in the village as Miss Brooks, at Wren's Peace, and the children at the well nodded to her, and Mrs. Rowe brought her a setting of eggs to put under a broody hen she had lent her, and the door of the public house stood open a little longer when she passed. She paid Mr. Ashby his 11 shillings and a further £1 for the plastering, and she paid Mr. Peckett the rates for the coming half-year, and she opened a small account at the post office at Chipping Barrow with 60 of the sovereigns, and kept the rest in the japanned tin box in a new place beneath a floorboard upstairs. She began to keep a ledger in the walnut writing box, in the same neat column her father had used, of every penny spent and every penny earned. The earnings came in slowly, and then more steadily. Mrs. Rowe's eldest son, Peter, aged 24, a drover, tore the shoulder of his coat on a gate, and Helen mended it invisibly for 3pence. And after that, She mended for the smith's wife, and for the vicar's housekeeper, and for a farmer's daughter, going to service in Chipping Barrow. And by Christmas she was taking in plain sewing and small repairs at a fair rate. And by Candlemas she had bought a second-hand treadle machine from a draper's widow in the town for £2.10, and set it under the kitchen window where the light was best. She kept Margaret Hurst's Bible on the dresser, and her mother's daguerreotype on the parlor mantel, and she planted the paddock in the spring, with 2 rows of potatoes, and a patch of onions and cabbages, and a corner of chamomile and feverfew. And Mrs. Rowe showed her how the ground took manure, and where the frost pocket lay. On Sundays she walked to St. Anne's Underhill, and sat in the pew that had once been her mother's family's, and the Reverend Whitcomb nodded to her from the chancel step, and Mr. Bligh kept the north wall grass short around the Tyack stones without being asked. People in the village stopped calling her the young woman at Wren's Peace, and began calling her Helen when they wanted her, and Miss Brooks when they were paying her, and both names felt to her like the same name spoken from 2 sides of the same room. On an evening in early May, when the paddock rows were showing their first green, and the rose over the porch had put out new leaves the color of pale cider, Helen sat at the deal table with the japanned tin box open in front of her, and the walnut writing box open beside it. The kitchen window stood a little ajar, and the sound of Mrs. Rowe's ewes on the slope beyond the wall came in with the smell of turned earth and coal smoke and the last of the day's bread. Helen had lit no candle yet. The grey light from the leaded panes, with its 4 new diamonds set by old Mr. Doggett, lay across the scrubbed elm boards and across her hands. She had taken out 3 things and set them side by side on the table. From the writing box she had taken her father's letter, folded now along its familiar creases, the ink at Anne, gone soft where her thumb passed each time she read. From beneath her collar she had lifted the silver locket that Margaret Hurst had put into her hand at the coach step in Ashwell 15 years earlier, with the pinch of her mother's hair coiled beneath the glass. And beside these she had laid the worn iron key on its black ribbon, with its trefoil bow and its bit cut in the pattern that fitted only her own oak door. 3 objects, and each of them from a person who had loved her without needing to be seen doing it. Margaret, who had taught her to bake bread and mend a chair and know beeswax from tallow, and had been sent to Lincolnshire with a small pension and a letter of character, and had thought to press the locket into her hand on the way out. Anne Tyack, born in these rooms, buried under the north wall at St. Anne's Underhill, who had left her nothing at all except her blood and her name in a parish register and a sprig of red hips still shaking on the porch. And Edmund Brooks, who had walked 60 miles twice a year for 23 years, and put 1 sovereign at a time into a Japan tin box under a flagstone, so that his daughter, when the house on Coppergate Lane closed against her, would have a door somewhere that opened only to her key. She thought of Cordelia and Reginald and Bertram and the good chair and the tight gloves and the folded letter from Suffolk and the fortnight allowed for her to find a situation. They had been given the house, the plate, the linen, the deposit at the Ashwell Bank, and the interest in the Marchmont Land Agency, and they had believed the division was complete. They had not known about the flagstone. They had not known about Anne. They had not known that the man they thought they had measured had kept, in a village they had never heard of, a whole second life, shaped entirely around the daughter they had put at the top of the stairs. Helen closed the tin box. She put the locket back under her collar, and the key with it. She folded the letter and returned it to the writing box. Outside, Mrs. Rowe called a dog by name, and the smith's hammer sounded twice from the far end of the row, and the sheep bell behind the church answered. Helen Brooks was 24, and she had been left almost nothing. She had £4, 11 shillings, and sixpence to her name, and a worn iron key on a black ribbon, and no address to try it against. And it was the best inheritance she was ever given. If this story stayed with you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who has been passed over in a will, or written out of a family Bible, or told that a fortnight would be reasonable. These stories reach the people they are meant for, because viewers like you pass them along, and every quiet share carries them further down the lane. Before you go, sit with this for a moment, and tell us in the comments, what is the smallest thing anyone ever left you? A key, a letter, a locket, a recipe, a habit, a way of standing at a window that turned out, in time, to be worth more than the whole estate? Who was the person nobody counted who counted you? And what door in your own life is still waiting for the key you already carry? Let us know where you are watching from, and settle in. There is another story waiting for you next, about a house nobody wanted, and the woman who saw what was under its floor.